Hi there, I'm Adam Durant with the Niagara Workforce Planning Board. In this series of videos, we're going to be exploring a deceptively simple question. What happened in 2020? COVID-19 has had and continues to have a serious impact on our local workforce. It's created new challenges for employers and job seekers while also accelerating issues that were already taking shape in our community. Our goal with this series is to help peel back the layers on the data so that everyone can understand the story of Niagara's labor force and how it coped with COVID-19. In this video, we're going to begin by asking what happened to employment patterns in 2020. Rather than talking about employment through rates and percentages, let's talk about this in terms of people. People who are working, people who are looking for work, and people who aren't working and aren't looking for work. This graph represents people who lived in Niagara and were working either for themselves or for an employer between November of 2019 and December of 2020. Keeping in mind that these are all estimates and not exact to-the-digit counts, we can see how many people went from working to not working during the pandemic. We can also see when those employment losses were most pronounced. Now, it's actually pretty normal to see some slight employment losses in the winter months in Niagara, and seeing more than 200,000 people working in Niagara in January of 2020 was a really positive start to the year. Once states of emergencies and lockdowns began in March, we started to see how that had an impact on our local employment. If we compare May, the month with the least amount of people working in Niagara, to February, the last month of typical employment patterns before the pandemic, we see that about 31,800 people lost work over 3 months. That's about 15% of the total number of people who were working in February of 2020. Now, the summer months did see some steady gains in the number of people working in Niagara. By October, we were almost back to February's pre-pandemic level of employment. And while employment gains are generally good, there are two caveats to what we saw in the second half of 2020. First, in any other year, the seasonal employment gains that we see over a summer would put us well above the employment levels observed in the winter. Second, we had a decline in employment in December of 2020, and the thing that drove that decline was fewer people working in retail and wholesale trade in December than we saw in November. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the next video. So now that we know what happened to people who were working in 2020, what about the people who were looking for work? This graph shows us the number of Niagara residents who were looking for work between November 2019 and December 2020. We see here that as the pandemic's effects made themselves present in Niagara, the number of people looking for work went up. That's pretty consistent with what we would expect from the data in the last slide. When people start losing employment, we typically end up with more people looking for work. What made 2020 different from past years is that all of that job seeking was happening while a pandemic shut down certain sectors of the economy and left others looking for ways to operate safely. Now, by August, we started to see the number of job seekers begin to drop. The 14,800 job seekers that we see in November of 2020 is still well above what we saw in February of 2020. And then in December, a month where the number of employed people went down, we began to see the number of unemployed people start going up again. Let's finish up by talking about one last group of people who are neither working nor looking for work. A person who isn't working and isn't looking for work is considered to be not in the labor force. Outside of a pandemic, there's any number of reasons why someone isn't in the labor force. Students, retirees, people who are focused on family care or child care, they're all not in the labor force, and those are perfectly expected reasons why someone wouldn't be in the labor force. COVID-19 introduced a new reason for why someone wouldn't be in the labor force. Their sector of employment was shut down, and just as we saw in previous graphs, the first COVID-19 lockdown saw a big jump in the number of people who were not in the labor force. In 3 months, there were an additional 19,400 people not working and not looking for work. And that's in addition to the 13,200 people who were looking for work. Let's put our data for people who were working and people who are not in the labor force on the same page together. A very interesting trend starts to present itself with this data. Unlike in past economic slowdowns, the challenges of 2020 saw people losing employment, and while some were able to keep looking for work, others left the labor force entirely. And by the end of 2020, we end up with about 13,000 fewer people in employment and 7,500 more people not in the labor force at all compared to the same time in the previous year. Now that's a lot of monthly data, and we know monthly data can be a bit volatile. So let's sum up with the annual data to really get a sense of how this changed from one year to the next. We see that 2020 had 13,700 fewer people in employment, 8,000 more job seekers, and 9,800 more people not in the labor force. These are very large changes, and they show how COVID-19 has had a drastic effect on our employment landscape. And while there's cause for some optimism with a gradual rollout of a COVID-19 vaccine, there's still going to be fluctuation and changes in the labor market on a month-to-month basis that are going to be difficult to track and even more difficult for employers and job seekers to respond to. Thank you for watching this video. For more information and the latest labor market numbers, please go to nwpb.ca and explore our data and community resources.